How do you reconcile with those realities where some are being asked to do a lot while others are doing a lot of damage?
Yeah, it's true. Why do I have to use a paper straw when, we're in the middle of how many wars going on right now?
I wonder sometimes if the media has gone too far with its dire warnings.
Nobody looks below the fold anymore to understand what the details are. And media executives and those that are pushing these messages, they're not dumb. They know that.
How do you advise that we even start to break through that without just feeling completely overwhelmed by it all?
It is overwhelming. I totally get that.
If all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and became truth.
Welcome to the Ministry of Media podcast, where we pull back the curtain and expose the lies in media, news, politics, and all the world around us. Today, my very first guest speaking in the interviews is John Pabon. And he's known as the greenwashing guy on TikTok. I've been following his career for quite some time. He's got 2 books out. One you can see right behind me there, called Sustainability for the Rest of Us. Yeah, got it behind him as well. And the second being The Great Greenwashing. And you got a new book coming out on the 3rd of April, 2026. So we're recording this just prior to that. So depending on whether you're seeing this podcast just before or just after, you'll be able to get your hands on that. It's called Strategic Sustainability, a Pragmatic Blueprint for Responsible Business. And all of that barely scratches the surface. So I want to, first of all, welcome you very much to the podcast, John.
I make the titles tongue twisters on purpose, so podcast hosts have to struggle through them. No, thanks for having me. This is fun. From TikTok to the quasi-real world. Here we go.
Yeah, exactly, mate. Yeah. And look, that little introduction, it really doesn't do justice to your experience. So can you give the audience here a bit of an idea on your background, where you've come from in the past and your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So anybody that's paying attention can hear I don't have an Australian accent, even though a lot of people in the US find one somehow, which is weird. But no, I'm originally from Los Angeles, even though I am in Melbourne, Australia now. I left the US probably 20-ish years ago, so sort of pinballed all around the world. Started my career at the United Nations in New York originally. That was always the goal, was to get into public policy. And I did that for a while and then left to go into the consulting world with McKinsey, AC Nielsen, and eventually BSR, who's sort of the McKinsey of the sustainability world. Took a trip to China, and I don't know if I'm going to say I fell in love with the place, but I liked it enough to move there for a little while, and a little while turned into a decade. And that's kind of where I honed my skills in, I guess, the sustainability world. So I had to find a way to use all of that public sector experience that I had already gained in a very commercial city. Shanghai is sort of capitalism on steroids. So I landed in sustainability, which is for me sort of the marriage of the private and the public sector, which I'm sure we'll get into. And I've been in that ever since. So again, working with BSR, but I have my own organization, Fulcrum Strategic Advisors. We focus more on the governance side, so the boring side of sustainability, not the sexy hugging trees and saving the polar bears. It's all the stuff that happens behind the scenes, and particularly the communications side of sustainability, which is why I'm super excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, awesome, mate. It's, so much experience in the industry. And so that's what, when I was putting together this podcast, I had a list of names that were on the top of the list, and it kind of fortuitously happened when I put out the promotion that the podcast was there. You commented and I went, hey, you were on that list right up the top there. So let's talk.
And we got it done in less than a week. Like literally, it's been 1 week since we started talking about it. So this is great. Love that.
Yeah, very quick and jumping right into it. It's a matter I think needs pretty urgent attention. So I'm happy we can talk about it very quickly. And the first question I want to start off, I'm all about exposing the lies in the industry. So very first question I wanted to ask you is, what is the biggest lie you see in the industry of sustainability and the environment at the moment?
The biggest one, and I think this is something I know it's something we've grappled with since sort of the beginning of the modern movement, which is kind of like the 1960s until now, is that we're kind of screwed. Like, the die is cast, we're done, forget it, there's no point doing anything. I think that's the biggest lie that gets peddled, and it's only gotten worse, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years. We call it doomism, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a doomist message. The end is here, why even bother? And look, Are things great? No. Are we where we thought we would be? No. Are we where we want to be? No, absolutely not. But that doesn't mean that, humanity is doomed. Quite the
Mm.
opposite. There's so much work that's happening, again, behind the scenes, but also stuff that people see day in and day out that, yeah, it's a lot slower than what we would like, but it's happening. So for anybody listening or watching, don't give up hope. There's plenty that is being done, and there's plenty you all can still do as well to counter that really false doomist narrative.
Yeah, and I wonder, because I see it a lot in the conversations these days, of this attitude where it seems to be like almost, I'm too small, the problem's too big, so why am I the one that has to deal with it, right? And that comes down to things like, why do I have to put up with the paper straw while the rich are flying around on private jets? So how do you, in the consumer level, in the everyday average punter, how do you kind of reconcile with those realities where some are being asked to do a lot while others are doing a lot of damage?
Yeah, and I'll start by answering that with just recognizing that, yeah, it's true. Why do I have to use a paper straw when, we're in the middle of how many wars going on right now that are just, what's the point of me using a paper straw if that's going to be going on? So I absolutely get that. And people that feel that way are absolutely right. I suppose I'll back up one step. From a we call it theory of change, even though that sounds really wanky. I hate saying that. The way my outlook on the world and sustainability is not an activist one. I'm not hanging off the side of a whaling ship anytime soon. I take a very pragmatic approach to things, and I'm just a normal human being like everybody else. So I recognize those struggles, and it really does come down to the marketing and how we've always marketed sustainability since sort of the 80s, right? There's again these doomist messages. It's these massive problems like the polar bear on the melting ice cap, or that kid in a faraway country you can sponsor. These things that are just, if you're one of almost 10 billion people in the world watching this stuff on TV, you sort of sit back and go, well, what the hell am I supposed to do about that? And that's exactly what you're talking about. It just seems so big. And so what I always recommend to people, and what was in sustainability for the rest of us, is really focusing down into what you're passionate about, and just almost be heartless in focusing on that. And that's a really hard psychological place to get to, because as altruists, as people that care, we want to do everything, right?
Mm.
And you're only one person, you can't do that. So instead of trying to take these massive issues that are far too big for one person to handle, break it down into something that you care about, something you have a special skill in. If you have a little bit of extra money, something you can spend toward, because we need money to make these things happen, and just focus on that stuff and be confident knowing there are people all over the world, billions hopefully, people that will pick up where you can't. And so for most people that are listening to this or watching this, it really does come down to how you spend your money. And I know there's going to be people going, capitalism, and yeah, I agree, but it's what we have for the moment. So until an economic genius comes up with something else, we got to work within the system. Unfortunately, I know people don't like to hear that, but how you spend your money matters. And unfortunately, that requires you, and nobody likes hearing this, to do a bit of research and to understand what you're spending your money on. 15, 20 years from now, I don't think we're going to have to be doing that anymore, hopefully.
Mhm.
But for the timeline that we're in, I think, given everything else we have to deal with, that's the least of our concerns, is do a bit of research.
Yeah, and it's a good point of like kind of that old saying of how do you eat an elephant, right? Yeah, by one bite at
One
a
bite at a
time,
time.
right? So you have to really, I say this in politics, in everything as well. You got to look at the issues that you can affect and try and make an effect in that.
And psychology backs this up. So Susan Clayton, she's at the College of Worcester in the US. She focuses exclusively on climate psychology, and she says that, or she's found that people who fare best in the face of all this stuff that's going on, they don't try to tackle the entire elephant. They take a bite out of the elephant. They look at what they can influence locally in their own little sphere of influence, she calls it. And that's how they make it through to the next day, because the stuff we do is not easy. We push stuff uphill every single day we step out of bed. So why make it that much harder on yourself? Just take a single bite of the elephant first.
And I know we sort of talking about, in my role in the media world, that's where my expertise lies. What role do you think media in particular has played in furthering the lies around climate and sustainability?
It's fascinating, and I've begun to work with the ad agencies in Australia and the media world over the past few years, quite closely, coincidentally, just because of the circles I was running in. And something that never occurred to me, even as somebody who works in sustainability communications, is why we haven't engaged the ad agencies and that part of the world more than we have to date. We've sort of put them to the side as being kind of the we'll get to you eventually. Let's
Mhm.
focus on these supply chains and these other big business. Why wouldn't we have approached the ones that are pushing or could potentially push that message? So to answer your question, I don't think we've engaged them at all. And those that have been engaged, ad agencies that, like, can we name names on this?
Sure, go for it.
Edelman is the I mean, they're sort of the Satan incarnate when it comes to bad agencies, because they work with all the bad unsustainable companies, right? We look at that and we wag our fingers and go, bad Edelman. But we've never thought, well, okay, well, how can we work with Edelman to get the right message out there? So I think there's a massive opportunity for agencies that are trying to not just do better altruistically, but also sustain their businesses in the long term, to start looking a little more holistically at how they can push sustainability messages. Some of the work that I do helps organizations and ad agencies that really don't know anything about sustainability to go, okay, if I have a company coming to me, they want to engage my agency, and they don't know anything about sustainability, what questions can I ask during the briefing process to actually start to embed that sustainability thinking into the organization from both the client side and the agency side? So it's sort of a dual learning that's going on, because there is kind of no knowledge of this stuff, and the knowledge that's there from both the agencies and a lot of the clients that they have is probably a lot of misinformed knowledge
Yeah.
as well. So we're trying to get them going in the right direction.
Yeah, I guess it's often advertising agencies picking up a message that a corporation of companies come to them with and go and push this message. That's what we're paying you for. And they're looking at previous wrong messages from other advertising agencies, other places, and going, okay, well, I'll push it in this manner.
And it's just a snowball effect, right? It just
Yeah.
chalks on to worse and worse and worse, and you're so deviated from what the message should be, and people think, oh, that's what it's supposed to be. So we're trying to rectify that a bit.
Yeah, and there was an example you used in the Great Greenwashing about, I believe you called it the term bluewashing, with Pepsi and the Kardashian ad, which was infamously pulled very quickly, and that's where I'm sort of getting with that as well. Is like advertising agencies, they almost too within their own bubble of experience and kind of talking each other up and patting each other on the back. So when they have these big grandiose ideas of, oh, let's put the polar bear on the ice cap again, it's just enforcing the wrong messaging instead of enforcing the right messaging, right?
Absolutely. And blue washing, for those who don't know what it is essentially tying an ad or a company to a social issue. And that's fine, but it becomes the washing part when you're not actually aligned with that social issue. A great recent example was the Sydney Sweeney ad for American Eagle jeans, where it was sort of a tongue-in-cheek, as people interpreted it was a tongue-in-cheek sort of eugenics, white supremacy message. And look, as it is in advertising, it's the same with greenwashing. It's not the intent of whatever message you're pushing, it's the effect of that message on the audience. So whether or not this is what they meant, American Eagle, the effect was that people are going, oh my God, dog whistle. And that's a form of blue washing as well, because American Eagle's sort of key philanthropies are around women's rights and equality. So how can you do that, but then push a dog whistly sort of ad that audiences clearly did not like?
Yeah, very clearly, yeah. And it is interesting. Look, I've been in the advertising world now coming up on 25 years, and I'm not out there working with BP or Shell or anything like that. But one of the things that I learned very early on in my career was that there was a phrase that got tossed around a lot, and that was that you sell your soul to work in advertising, right? And I learned very early on having to make dodgy ads for car dealerships, putting out dodgy loans to retirees and stuff like that. That it's difficult because I mentioned this in my book, where we're in this world of, as you mentioned before, capitalism, right? Everyone's trying to put food in their belly, trying to keep a roof over their head. So when advertisers have clients coming to them and they're being paid to push a message, that's what the whole organization from top to bottom, the camera operators, editors, they're all just being paid to do their job. I used to try and get away with it by, if it was a dodgy ad, making it look as dodgy as possible.
Just make it really clear.
Yeah, try. Like if someone buys off the back of this ad, they're doing a very bad job, like that's on them. But, advertisers do share in that sort of culpability, as we're mentioning there. So how do you think we can almost like encourage advertisers to do better? And it'd be pretty tough if BP's coming to you saying, make us look green and we'll pay you $100 million. How do we help advertisers go in the right direction?
It's a fascinating question. I think a big part of this lies in recognizing which industries and companies in particular, particularly through the lens of sustainability, just can't be sustainable, right? We know who those players are. We know it's the fossil fuel companies, coal, gas, anything you dig out of the ground. Defense is there, tobacco is there. You sort of have alcohol there as well, and gambling too. So when they push these messages of, BP is, I saw one the other day, it was one of the big coal companies talking about how they're helping societies and blah, blah, blah. I mean, okay, great. But consumers recognize that all of that is sort of greenwashing. They're trying to change their image, or they're lying to consumers. So if that's the case, then the ad agencies should advise their clients saying, hey, that's probably not a great angle to go with. Why don't you just be honest about what you're doing and find a totally different creative angle? Don't try the green angle, because people aren't going to resonate with it. We'll gladly take your money, but we're going to steer you in a different direction. For the other industries where, they are more sustainable and they aren't necessarily trying to be duplicitous in their messaging, then it's about guiding them towards even better messaging, as you were sort of talking about. But for those really bad, I call them the unsustainables, just stop lying, because at the end of the day, consumers aren't dumb. Viewers aren't stupid. They don't like to be lied to. That's when they get really pissed off. So just be honest. You're a gas company. Why do you need to pretend you're not?
Yeah. No, I had to laugh at a section in the Great Greenwashing book where you're mentioning one of the CEOs of the weapons manufacturers being in the top 10 or something of the sustainable reports, right? And you're like, yeah, I'm sure someone that's getting their village bombed would be very grateful that they're being so sustainable about it, right? So yeah, there are those industries that you got to kind of go, well, they're gone, but we're not going to be able to help them really, but trying to help in the other areas, right? You're going to be able to have a bigger impact in those other areas anyway, right?
Absolutely. And that's what it comes down to, is where's the biggest bang for the buck, so to speak. And we just talked about defense. I should have used bang. But the biggest bang for the buck, right? Where are you going to have the most positive impact? Recognizing that, again, it's slow, right? And it's incremental, but any move in the right direction, anytime you move that needle in the right way, that is progress. So how are you going to do that? And we talked about the unsustainable characters that we all know and don't love, but some of them are genuinely trying to change, but it's like moving a battleship in the water. Keep using military references. So for those that are being absolutely genuine, and they're sort of few and far between, but we should be there to sort of guide and help them. It's about sussing out whether they are genuine, and that's a really fine balance to walk, not just in the ad agency world, but the sustainability world as well. If I have BP come to me and say, hey, we know we screwed up, we want to change. Okay, I mean, your track record, I don't believe you, but what can we do together? And I'll qualify that by saying I've not worked with BP. But if they ever were to come to me, I would have to be really, really cautious and really look at the entire scope. One time when I was working, when I was with BSR, we had a very prominent tobacco company come to us and say, hey, we'd love to run a human rights assessment with you guys. And human rights, the basis of all human rights, the number one thing is you can't kill anybody. That's sort of just the foundation, obviously. Yeah. So to run a human rights risk assessment, which basically analyzes how closely you're aligned with human rights, but your product kills people, the company sort of went, well, like, can we work with you guys? Or, are we just helping you greenwash? And it was quite a big debate. And we ended up not working with them, obviously. But these are the sort of the things that happen behind the scenes that we have to grapple with, is the genuine nature of our companies really wanting to change, or are they just trying to absolve their bad behavior through a little bit of greenwashing? It's not as easy, kids, as it might look. I wish I could flip a switch and everything would be better, but not the real world.
Yeah, and it takes a lot of moral backbone as a company to make those stances as well. You're mentioning there before about advertisers coming, or tobacco companies coming to yourself, having that discussion and having to go, no, well, we're actually going to turn them away. That takes a lot for a company not to just go, well, I'll grab every piece of profit that I possibly can.
And it's even worse because we turned them away and they went right to somebody who would take the money. Yeah. And so it doesn't solve the problem because it's just somebody else's logo on the final report.
Right. Yeah. To bring it back to, I guess, news media here a little bit, I wonder sometimes whether the media has, you talked about the sort of doom and gloom that has been reported so much. I wonder sometimes if the media has gone too far with its dire warnings, because I do get a lot of comments all the time from people that against really taking any action on the climate crisis or anything like that say, well, the media said that the ice caps would melt in the 70s, but that hasn't happened. So throw it all away, right? And I guess it's this problem with media where media agencies, especially in the news, are always trying to find the most fresh, most up-to-date, most recent story. And so especially when it comes to reporting on scientific issues, it's a kind of hit and miss that they do a lot of the time, right? Because a new report may come out that's proven wrong 3 months later, but all the news jump on this big new report. They then put it to the back that it was wrong later. So we end up in a bit of a like boy who cried wolf mentality, right?
That there's no journalistic ethics anymore, and I'm painting with very broad strokes, is mind-blowing to me, particularly in the science elements of what we do. Because if there were ethics, then they would have to report as strongly on things that were retracted or present facts. But as we know, if it bleeds, it reads. So whatever the most dire warning is, nobody's going to look beyond, nobody looks below the fold anymore to understand what the details are. And media executives and those that are pushing these messages, they're not dumb. They know that. They know people aren't going to look at the specifics. And I'm not just going to blame the media. I blame my own colleagues and peers in the sustainability world as well. We're just as bad with using jargon and numbers, and assuming people are going to read and understand as deeply as we do is kiss of death, because nobody does and nobody wants to. So really simplifying how we present these messages is so important, particularly for me, and it's kind of been my thing throughout my career, is how do we simplify this stuff so it makes sense. Now, media is not going to do that beyond simplifying things to scare the hell out of people. So how we rectify that is, it unfortunately is going to come down to individuals doing their own research, going to the right news sources, hopefully having a healthy media diet, which I think increasingly people are, so you can sort of balance things out. And I think as well, for a lot of those really dire warnings that come from, we know which media outlets they come from. A lot of people look at that and go, oh, come on, guys. Like, honestly, you don't expect me to believe that. But of course, there's still a sizable population that looks at that and goes, oh my God. Or, oh, I'm not going to believe 99% of scientists that said X, Y, or Z because I looked at Google once. So it really does come down to individual responsibility and understanding those media outlets are not necessarily approaching things with our best interest in mind, or the planet's.
Yeah, and I think especially, this has been going on for decades now.
It's not new.
Yeah, so, and especially with the rise of social media as well, it's just moved towards more of this clickbaity headlines to try and get people in. And I often, I see headlines and I go, that's ridiculous. And I go to scroll by and I think, no, wait, I have to see what's inside that and see what they actually wrote about. And sometimes you click on it and it is almost completely the opposite of what the headline actually said. And so you have all these people in the comments that are arguing about the headline, not understanding anything of the full context because the article itself disproves its own headline. And these days where you have social media can do a A/B test on your headlines as well, and what you post is better performing. You might have an ethical headline versus a non-ethical headline, and well, the one that just gets the most clicks is going to win out, right?
Of course, and we're all guilty of that. I do the same thing. If it's a sensationalistic headline, I go, oh, let me, at least I look into the article. But, a lot of times that's all it takes for most people is just, oh, I saw this headline, it was really crazy. But if you were to see a more tame or ethically written headline, it's probably not going to generate the eyeballs.
That's right, yeah. And, talking about how the media can sort of better represent the issues, right? I wonder if there's, if you have a solution in mind for how they can more clearly represent these, because I'm always reminded there was a sketch that John Oliver did on his Last Week Tonight show. And I looked it up because I thought it was very recent, but it was 11 years ago that he done this sketch. And in it, he basically talks about whenever climate change is brought up, they have Bill Nye the Science Guy versus some dude, right? And then in the sketch, he goes on to go, well, a more appropriate thing would be to have 3 people, Bill Nye the Science Guy and another 96 scientists. So you got 97 on one side and 3 on the other, because that's the actual physical representation of it. And in that environment, that was before social media really taken off, where you still did have Bill Nye, at least, right? Now you just have some guy. So how do you think, particularly with the rise of social media, we can better represent these issues?
Yeah, I think social media, it is a double-edged sword, and John Oliver always hits these things out of the park as well. I think particularly his style and the way he dives deep into things is kind of how we should be approaching a lot of this. It's no longer just quantity over quality of messaging. It should be, a single message, and we understand it quite deeply if it's of interest to us. I think that's how we probably historically approached media, and what we sort of need to go back to. So social media, absolutely, it's bad in a lot of ways for sure, but if it's used the right way, and if there's education behind how people use it, and I would do the same thing with sort of large language models, how we are educated to use these things properly, then they're a massive amount of information. We have more information in the palm of our hands than, royals 50 years ago could have ever imagined having. Yeah. So why not use that to our advantage? So it is becoming media literate as individuals. Again, and this might sound quasi-doomist, and I don't mean it to be, but not trusting that media has our best interest in mind because they've sort of shown their hand. So that's why that really healthy media literacy diet is so important, because you can then start to create your own understanding of things if you're approaching different channels that have even opposing views to what you might think about. Because I think what social media has, and this is not groundbreaking, done is put us all into silos, right? We're so fractured because we can only listen to voices that agree with us, or different. We aren't forced to look at different voices or hear different voices, and I think that's not the greatest thing. And I'm sure traditional legacy media is certainly tapping into that to fracture us even more. Bobby Duffy, who's sort of a research guru, he has a book called Perils of Perception, 2018 or 2019, so before the pandemic, and he talked about that fracturing of society, particularly through social media and traditional media, and ways to sort of bring things back together. And for this conversation, I wish I remembered what his recommendations were, but it is certainly around media literacy, having a healthy diet, and getting out of those silos that we have put ourselves in, which all of that is easier said than done.
Yeah, and it can be quite a painful experience. I talk about that in my book as well, and that's why I got out and started doing all this social media stuff, is being in the media, and knowing, even in your role where the kind of approach that companies and stuff are taking, you see it very clearly where others just might see the greenwashing and it just flows by them, right? So it is important to look around and try and find different voices and try and break apart the argument as well. And sometimes it is literally so simple to find the answer to your question, where you just type into Google your absolute kind of brain fart of a question. You don't even have to ask it in a really nice way. You can just ask it and find the results so quickly, but it's so often repeated. And as something where it might have been in the 1984 Orwellian book, right? Where like just that repetition of things, it then becomes the truth, right? You hear something so much, it becomes truth. So we have to kind of step away and go, well, why am I hearing that so much? Is that the truth, or have I just heard it so much that I now believe it's the truth?
Which is how these things work, whether it's from a corporate comms perspective, media perspective, is a lot of people think these things are accidental. And I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist for a moment, and I'm not. Believe me, I'm not. But these companies invest millions of dollars, and they have such sophisticated technologies into trying to figure out how to essentially dupe viewers and to lie to them. So when you see these messages come out, especially if you see it happen all of a sudden, then there is probably a coordinated campaign going on behind the scenes that you should be hyper aware of. You and I are both on TikTok, and I think the biggest thing over the past few weeks has been this sudden surge of sort of AI fruit stories. So it's these sitcoms with AI generated fruit, but they sort of came out of nowhere. There's no, they haven't sort of slowly drip fed into the, it just all of a sudden they were everywhere. And so you sort of go, okay, think critically and don't just take things at face value. And you go, okay, well, what's the aim here? What is happening? Is it an AI model training something? What is the purpose of this? Because it doesn't come out of nowhere. And it's the same thing with all messaging. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It's very, very purposeful. So you definitely understand when you start to see these things that there is a reason to start researching and looking into, okay, don't take this all at face value. And in addition to that, plus the silos, plus everything else we've talked about, there's obviously the resurgence of anti-intellectualism. You talked about Bill Nye and the 97% of scientists that believe in climate science versus the 3 guys on Reddit, and for some reason we trust the 3 guys on Reddit now more than the 97% of scientists. So we need to go back to intellectualism. And again, don't trust everybody at face value, but if it's a scientist who've devoted their entire life to this sort of stuff, they probably know what they're talking about. Listen to them and save yourself a Google search.
And there was someone talking about the conspiracy theory that I saw as well, of like scientists trying to withhold information, and they essentially kind of like, no, if you ask any scientist, they want to give you, they will give you their whole research paper because they are dying for people. They want people to know what they're talking about, so they're dedicating their lives to it. And I think that's a big thing where the rise of that anti-intellectualism, like you're saying, like, it's been kind of placed on, universities are bad and all this sort of stuff. And it spreads us apart in so much of what a fact is and versus what an opinion is. And as part of the reason why I wanted to do this podcast, because I have knowledge in one area, a couple of areas very well, but I don't know everything. And I think a big problem that we see today is people want to act and feel like they do know everything. And I'm more than happy for people to tell me I'm wrong and to find out that a view I had 2 months ago, 2 years ago, 2 hours ago was incorrect. And I think a lot of people need to kind of, when you see things that make you angry, make you fearful, give you those reactions, or start to feel defensive of your own self and your own, well, no, that's what I believe in, so stay away from me sort of reactions. You really have to pull that apart and try and take that step back to see the bigger picture, right?
Absolutely. You look at your own psychology as well and why you feel these things, and you understand, okay, well, something is opposing my worldview. Is this worth my time of dissecting this and figuring out why? Am I going to be better from it? Or do I want to hold on to this tightly held worldview for whatever reason is really important. So I agree 100%. And I think certainly, and what I always tell people is anybody who calls themselves an expert, run the other way, because there is no such thing as an expert. We saw this all the time in China where people would, put on their business cards, oh, I'm a China expert. I'm just thinking to myself, okay, a country with 5,000 years of history, how many billions of people that don't even know, they wouldn't even call themselves an expert. And all of a sudden this white guy from, Texas or a China expert, give me a break. So run the other way if someone calls themselves an expert and if they refuse to listen to different opinions or to change their own.
Yeah, for sure. And like you talked about just before there, how purposeful everything is within media, within companies, brands. And it is, the example of, say, McDonald's, where their colors are copyrighted. You cannot use McDonald's red and McDonald's yellow. Every single word you see if it's a billboard that has just a few words on it, every one of those words, I guarantee, has had hours of thought put behind it.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And ridiculous meetings and bureaucracy within corporations, how they act. If there's a meeting upon a meeting upon a meeting to figure out whether they should use are or is,
Yep.
It's very purposeful. And you talk about the illusion of choice when it comes to consumers purchasing products. And you give a great example really early on in the Great Greenwashing book about walking down the supermarket aisle and trying to find the product that is the eco-friendly, the sustainable, the green option. So with so much purpose put behind the lies and deception of greenwashing there, how do you advise that we even to start to break through that without just feeling completely overwhelmed by it all?
It is overwhelming. I totally get that. And for anybody who thinks you're exaggerating, no, I've spent countless hours at the UN discussing a placement of a comma. Like, it is not we call it wordsmithing. It is not a joke. So anytime you it's politics, it's corporations, it's all of them. None of this happens by accident, because there are just troves of people that and layers of approvals that these have to go to. So if we go back to that American Eagle ad, people go, oh, well, that was just a silly marketing ploy. No, there are so many people that had to approve this stuff. All the, things that politicians, there's so many groups of people that approve this. So nothing is just one person making a mistake. There's lots of people making a mistake. But to counter greenwashing and the amount of effort that companies go to try to pull a fast one on consumers, again, as we talked about at the beginning, it does take research, which is an unfortunate reality. So understanding what companies are good, and which ones are not. And there are plenty of online sites, depending what you're shopping for, that make that fairly easy now, which is really, really good. For fashion, for example, goodonyou.eco is a great website for basically any company that produces anything with textiles. Really great resource. And there's plenty for other consumer goods as well. But barring that, it's sometimes kind of easy to suss out, because even though these companies are spending lots of money to try to fool you, they're not always the best at it. So the first one is anything that is sort of traditional marketing around sustainability. So the fluffy language that kind of doesn't make sense, the use of terms that you hear far too often, eco-friendly, net zero, green, all this sort of stuff, or the use of numbers without any meaning, no quantification of things, really fancy back of pack language, and you sort of scratch your head and go, I don't know, what did that just say? That sort of stuff, trust your gut, it's probably greenwashed in some way, shape, or form. There's the use of semiotics, which is just a fancy word to describe how we use symbols to denote meaning. The classic example is a box that is green. That's supposed to mean something. It doesn't mean anything just because the box is green. They just painted it green. A car advert where the car is driving through a pristine forest, right? Like, sure, the car may be eco-friendly. I don't know, though. The ad didn't tell me that. So these sort of messages that you see. My favorite one, this was again from China, was this massive sort of construction site. And out in front, they would have these tall walls to hide the construction site. And it would have like pastoral scenes on it. I'm like, I'm breathing in the cancerous dust. This scene doesn't do anything for me. So there's those. And then sometimes companies will over inundate you with information that you just don't need. So those are sort of the three telltale signs that you're being greenwashed to. Once you've trusted your gut, you've done a bit of research, you can probably land on a few brands that you can trust. So it's that initial effort to get over the wall. And from there, you build a bit of brand loyalty and continue buying the stuff that's good. There are plenty of brands that are genuinely good for the planet or good for humans, eco-friendly, green, sustainable brands that we kind of know of, the Patagonias, Dr. Bronner's of the world. Sometimes brands, especially at the grocery store, will have little stamps on them. So the most notable are the Rainforest Alliance stamp, which is a little tree frog. You usually see that on things like coffee and tea. Any wood products that you would get from like IKEA or something like that will have a forest sort of trees on them, and that's a stamp of approval. So look for those sorts of things as well, and that will get you a long way ahead of the marketing teams that are trying to lie to you.
Yeah, and it's looking for the right labels, those right little stamps of approval too, right? Like I know there's a lot of, especially with the rise of people selling on Amazon, Shopify, that sort of thing. I used to work with the company that taught people, coach people into how to create those products and sell. And we used to try and, teach them to, have a ethical company and source the products ethically and package it all nicely and things like that. But what we did see was a lot of that kind of, they'll almost copy that little rain frog, but it won't be the exact same thing. So it gives you the taste of it. And a lot of these brands are going to get away with it, especially when you're doing online shopping, because no one's really checking them. There's tens of thousands of products on Amazon, and Amazon itself isn't exactly the most sustainable, eco-friendly company out there. So it's hard to look at them and think, well, they're going to take the initiative to go out and take all these out, right?
It's
it
true.
comes down to the people, the consumers, finding it, calling it out, and reporting when that sort of stuff happens too.
Absolutely. There are really devious marketing teams that have created similar stamps of approval. So you have to know what the actual one really does look like. They've created their own as well, which is just silly. But there are a few that once you know what they look like, you can sort of see the deception. And one thing for people to also know, which is sort of messes with your head. We think about marketing, and there are laws around responsible marketing. Generally speaking, around the world, there are things you can and can't market. There's false advertisement, all this sort of stuff. But for some reason, sustainability stuff is flown underneath the radar. So it's kind of the Wild West. There is no ethical marketing around sustainability, even though technically there should be.
Yeah. And I guess that comes down to like government regulations there as well. And because it's hard to know, like false advertising when you're telling a lie and being able to call that out. And with so much uncertainty, I think, around that idea of environmentalism and sustainability, it's a lot more difficult to call those out, right?
There's a reason the Exxon Mobils of the world have been greenwashing for 60 years and no one's called them out, because their lawyers find a loophole to say, we weren't falsely advertising. We told you the truth. You just didn't understand it. Santos is a great one. So Santos was just in federal court the end of 2025. And even when they were giving their closing depositions against they were in a greenwashing case, their lawyers got up, their barristers, and they were like, well, in not so many words, they said, it's not our fault. You didn't understand it. It's your fault for being dumb. And then they got let off with a slap on the wrist. So
amazing. That's a great defense. Great lawyers.
You're the dumb one, not us. Which, I mean, are they wrong though? Is the question. Like, maybe they're right.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to see how they frame that. And look, one of the things too with sustainable products that you find, I wonder with the cost of sustainability as well, right? We're in a cost of living crisis, and it's often difficult to pick the eco-friendly option if that's going to cost you more than the no-name option. So do you think that there is something that the consumers can do in that circumstance? Or is this where we really do need to be doing a bigger push for the brands and the corporations themselves to make that change so that the no-name product itself is more eco-friendly?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. So if we look maybe 10 or even 5 years ago, going after things that were good for you, good for the planet, sustainable, eco-friendly, organic, whatever that is, it was not cost competitive. It was very expensive, broadly speaking, in most places around the world. But over the past 10 years, these things have grown at scale, and enough companies have started to embed more sustainable practices into what they're doing that we've seen the cost of anything good fall dramatically, to where in a lot of places it's now on par with non-good products. So this idea that anything sustainable is automatically going to be more expensive is sort of an outdated concept now. Yeah, sure, it exists, obviously, of course, depending how unscrupulous different companies are being and how much they want to charge a price premium. But
Yeah.
typically it should not be there. So if you do see it happening, it's a bit of price gouging going on. Organic is a great example of this, where now if I go to the Preston Market to do my shopping, all organic stuff there, it's going to be markedly cheaper than going to Woolies. So that wouldn't have been the case 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So that is sort of where consumers need to go in terms of their thinking around a lot of fast-moving consumer goods. But the biggest shift I want to see people making, and this is more for big ticket items, if people can afford it. And I'm going to preface all of this by saying I'm in a position of privilege and I can afford these things, and not everybody is there. So don't come for me with what I'm about to say. But if you are going to purchase something, think of it through the lens of cost per use versus initial outlay. So let's take the example of a new jacket, right? You might want to go to an H&M or a Shein because the cost of that jacket is much lower versus going to somewhere in your local neighborhood, local craftsperson that is going to cost, God only knows how much more. But that piece from Shein is probably going to fall apart in a matter of months, whereas that piece that you paid more for from a locally lovingly crafted designer is going to last you the rest of your life. So do the math and figure out, okay, if I can afford it now, would I rather spend a bit more on something that's going to last all of my life, or a bit less on something that I'm going to have to replace in a matter of months? And that's how we should really start seeing the matter of shopping, I think. And I talk about this in the Great Greenwashing quite a bit, particularly around fashion, how we've gone away in the recent past from seasonal cycles of fashion into fast fashion, right? Things that I need something new. I need lots of new things. I need a haul every week. And that's not how things were. I mean, I'm not that old. And I remember in high school, girls were making their prom dresses by hand, right? They weren't buying them. I had cloth nappies when I was a baby. Like it's that not that long ago that we were thinking a lot more consciously about the things we were shopping, and it wasn't a fast fashion model. And I say all of that because that means it's not hardwired into us to buy all the time. It's really our default should be to be more conscious about the things we're buying, why we're buying it, and especially in a cost of living crisis, why would you want to spend more on crap? Just spend your money smarter. So if you do have to buy something, think about it in an intelligent way. Don't just buy because somebody on TikTok has done a Shein haul, which neither you or I will ever do.
No. And it is a huge problem. I was only just talking just with my wife recently about planned obsolescence in products. You know, we're going through it where a fridge of ours is busted down, and the repairer is saying out of the millions of products that are made, they have such a massive percentage of returns on that product. And it's not the cheapest fridge, it's not the most expensive fridge. But if you're going to have to replace it every couple of years, then it's more expensive than buying the really expensive one. So it is a hard mix of trying to go, okay, where's that sort of cost-effective purchase for me, not just the cheapest all the time.
And that's a great microcosm of the idea of sustainability and doing good for the planet in general. Is we have to balance out that long-term vision we're trying to make this place better for everybody. And a lot of the work that I know I do and a lot of people are doing, we're not going to see the payoff for that, right? This is for generations in the future. So how do I balance that with the short-term gains? And it's the same thing with fashion, with anything that we buy, and then at a micro level or a macro level with the work we're doing to save the planet and humanity.
And you talk about how the private sector may be our savior, and that sustainable companies. A lot of people are going to love that line. But the sustainable companies are high performing as well, and I'm reminded of speech that Arnold Schwarzenegger did. I don't know, I think it was after he was actually governor, but he put a video out which in it very poorly paraphrased of Arnold, but he said essentially, I don't care if you believe in the doomsday side of climate change, the economic side of moving towards the Green New Deal and a green economy is worth the transition. that's the way it needs to go. Whether you believe the world's going to burn or not, the quicker we get there, the better for everyone. So how do you think, you just talked about that short-term, long-term thinking. How do you think we can get corporations, governments, people thinking in the long term and maybe managing some of that short-term pain?
Yeah, I mean, you can't sell crap on a dead planet, can you? So Arnold, for all his faults, he was right. So
Yeah.
it is about that, and there are plenty of companies that are doing just that. They've found a way to marry that very short-term thinking, which any major business has to apply to them, right? Like board members and C-level people, they're graded quarter by quarter, or they're out of a job. So they have to deliver on things. But the work we do in sustainability is certainly not quarter by quarter. We're talking maybe 5-year cycles, and that's a good thing. So these companies have found a way to marry that short-term necessity with the long-term vision to embed, and I hate using these phrases, but embed sustainability into their organizations and their ways of thinking. And also being patient enough. That's the key, is they have to be patient to understand that this is a long-term play, and they're looking at the long-term sustainability writ large for their business. The business is going to be around in 10, 15, 20 years time, because those businesses that are the dinosaurs now that haven't started a sustainability journey are already well behind, but there's not going to be a place for them in the world 20 or 30 years from now. Hopefully there is a world in 20 or 30 years. There will be, but there won't be a place for them in the consumer markets, because consumers aren't going to stand for it. The supply chains that they rely on will have moved on into greener ways, and it's just not going to work, except for a lot of those unsustainable businesses, the petrochemicals of the world, which are a necessary evil for the time being, unless we figure out something to replace them, or until we do. Right. For everybody else, they're going to have to start to play ball around this. So it is marrying the short-term and long-term thinking within businesses. And for anybody listening and watching, there are plenty of companies that are doing that. You may not see it because, you don't see a lot of what happens behind the scenes. And these companies are not perfect. I'm not letting them off the hook, because there's no such thing as a perfect company, but there is a lot of stuff happening. I just wish companies were a little bit more open about the good stuff that they're doing. A lot of them are quite scared of making any statements around the positives that they're doing, because they're worried those will be picked apart by people looking only for the negatives. So I think as consumers and as general stakeholder audiences external to a business, we have to give them a little bit of grace as well, in terms of, recognizing the good things that they're doing, holding them to account for the bad stuff that happens as well, but encouraging the good stuff to continue to happen, so they're out and loud and proud about it, which will then encourage them to continue on that journey and hopefully bring a few others along with them as well.
Yeah, because you mentioned too about, there was a quote like "perfection be damned," right? And that's where so many people, I think, particularly in the left wing of the world, really do hold a level of perfectionism over things as well. And it is a very important subject. I'm not trying to diminish the idea of saving the environment as not being worth perfection, but there's the milestones and the minor stones, right? And you got to try and celebrate those minor stones in getting to the bigger picture. And you may trip over as you're trying to get there, but as long as you're trying to head in that right direction, that should be encouraged, right?
Absolutely. And that's, I say it all the time, especially to corporate audiences, is your stakeholders don't expect perfection from you. They just don't want you to lie to them. So put all the cards on the table. Say the great things you're doing, but say the struggles you're having as well. And a lot of times, this is a different conversation for a different day. The stuff that corporations face, nothing is new under the sun. Like I sit in meetings with lots of these people, and rarely do I ever hear an issue that we haven't solved 10 years ago. It's just about getting them to say, "Oh, I have this issue. Does someone have a solution for me?" versus reinventing the wheel. God, the last thing we need is a shiny new object in sustainability. Please stop creating apps and tech and all. We have all the answers. We just lack the willingness for these things to be implemented.
Gotcha. Yeah. And look, we've talked about, I know we're coming up on the end of our time here, but I know we've talked about the personal and sort of business sectors. And I want to bring back to, we talked at the start about that feeling all too big from a personal perspective, but also on the national level. something here I hear a lot is this argument of why should Australia reach net zero when China and India are still out burning fossil fuels? Like we're going to lose our competitiveness in switching to a green energy, green environment. What would you have to say to that? Because really, if business is competitive, surely governments and nations are also going to be competitive in the green sector, right?
First, so we all share the same rock, and things like pollution and in the environment, they don't recognize political borders. I think our leaders in our capital cities have a hard time grasping that. But they face the same issues that corporate leaders face, is they're judged on very short-term metrics, not long-term vision. They're on 2, 3, 5-year political cycles. So they're worried about their next election, not what is going to save the planet long term and what's going to help their grandchildren. So that they're not unique in terms of the issues they face with marrying the long and the short-term visions. But they're also sort of, in a lot of ways, particularly in the developed north, they're the dinosaurs of the world, because the developed south, which is where I've spent the majority of my career, is just, from a political perspective, is going gangbusters. Like they're really forward thinking about, okay, how do we build that better future? And like you mentioned a few minutes ago, a lot of it is, one step forward, 2 steps back, but at least they're trying something. The global north is very wedded in their ways, and the outlook of, why should I do this if this country is not doing that? Not recognizing that all of this is interconnected, right? If I am sitting in Los Angeles and I buy my iPhone in LA, it has to go to China to be created. It has to be shipped across an ocean. And ultimately what I'm saying is, where's the culpability for all of this, right? The minerals come from somewhere in Africa. Australia is supplying parts of the steel and building data centers left, right, and center all through the middle of the country that nobody seems to realize is happening. And then China is doing its part to put all these pieces together. Some shipping company is sending it over to my house in, LA, where it had to be shipped to me on an Amazon. Like, there's so many steps. You can't point a finger and say, oh, it's your fault we have emissions. Because if that was genuinely the case, then it wouldn't be China's fault. It would be the person in LA's fault that should be culpable for all of this. So they're on the hook. So we should be pointing our fingers at them saying, hey, you stop what you're doing, or I'm not going to be doing any better as a country. Yeah. So it's not as black and white as a lot of people make this out to be. It is so highly nuanced in terms of where we place blame, if there's any to be placed at all, versus just recognizing that we're all sort of culpable for this together. And I think governments need to certainly recognize that. And unfortunately, they haven't. There is a great resource called the Climate Action Tracker. Since Paris in 2015 and the Paris Agreement, they've tracked how close countries are to actually achieving their stated Paris targets. Not a single country has come close in the 10 years since Paris.
Crazy.
At all. And most are actually really far away from the goals that they set for themselves. Like, this wasn't the UN setting these goals. Individual governments said, yeah, we could do this. Yeah. Not a single one of them has come close. I think the Gambia or Gabon has the only one that's come even close to achieving their goals. So no government, developed or not, is anywhere close. But generally speaking, those in the developing world are much further along and closer to achieving the goals than any country in the developed world is. I know that probably didn't answer the question, but it let me get on a soapbox for a minute.
No, it did help. I think I liken it to in your neighborhood, right? I used to live in a neighborhood where down the street there was a one particular house, and a lot of Australians will probably relate to this, where one house had overgrown yard. They had old car bodies stacked up on top of each other, and they used to do like demo derbies and stuff like that, right? So it's a really run down, crazy house, right? If your neighbor's house looks like that, that doesn't mean that you want your own house to look like that. It doesn't take away the responsibility or the moral responsibility that you have for yourself to make your own house look nice and keep your own yard tidy. So what we do within each and every nation is keeping our own yard tidy, and hopefully that encourages a better community across the board. Because if everyone just gave up because that one yard was horrible, then suddenly every yard is horrible, and that's
a race to the bottom.
opposite direction. Yeah. Now, look, there's one final question I want to have to you today. It's been a great conversation. I know, just very aware of your time. And that is that, again, we're in a capitalist world. There always, with governments, business, everything, there always does seem to be someone that's going to try and cut corners. Now, your latest book, The Strategic Sustainability, a Pragmatic Blueprint for Responsible Business. Bam, nailed that time.
You got it. Splice that into the beginning. You got
it. I'll cut. We'll cut around that. In that, obviously, I haven't been able to read it yet. But how do you think we best ensure businesses, governments, everyday people are actually kept to that promise or that responsibility for sustainability?
Yeah, it does come down to, and I call myself a pragmatic altruist, right? As I sort of mentioned and teased throughout this entire conversation, it's not about doing these extreme actions, although if that's your bag, go for it. If you want to hang off the side of that whaling ship, more power to you. I'm not going to do it. I have my own little piece of the universe, as we mentioned, it's focusing on what you're passionate about, what you have that skill or that expertise or love for, and just doing that and being pragmatic about what impact that is actually going to have, what impact the private sector, the public sector is having, and recognizing this is slow and incremental, but it absolutely is happening. So caring, having that altruistic side and wanting to do better and be better and create better for everybody, but being pragmatic that it isn't as easy as flipping a switch. It's not black and white. It's highly nuanced, and it does take a bit of time. And I think the more people embrace this idea of pragmatic altruism, I genuinely believe that is going to help us. Like we were talking about with Susan Clayton and this psychology of your sphere of influence, it's going to help us get up in the morning more energized to do the work we do, because as we said, this is not easy stuff to try to save the world. I wish it was. It's not. So if we focus more and we're more pragmatic about what we're trying to do, it will keep us going for the long haul. We talk about the marriage of short term with long term. We need to be in this for the long term because the issues we face are big. So whatever we can do to help ourselves get up in the morning energized to do the work is only going to be beneficial for all.
Amazing. Well, John, mate, I'm sure we could continue chatting for a long time. I'm sure I'll watch this back and have 1,000 more questions that I want to ask you again. But I do really thank you for your time.
Thank you.
For everyone out there listening, watching this, do all the good algorithm stuff, like, subscribe, comment, share it with everyone. Let it be known that this conversation should be listened to. And hopefully join us, because we're going to have a lot more conversations with experts in their field, trying to pull back the curtain and reveal what is the actual truth and find the positive side of all the negativity that's put out there. So John, again, thank you so much for joining us today. And
absolutely. Thank you.
I'll be continuing following you all across social media, and
you can watch us. You can watch us dancing on TikTok. Just kidding. We don't.
Yeah, you can do the dancing.
Yeah, I'm hard pass.
But yeah, go out there, grab his books. They're amazing. Thank you so much again, and see you next time, everyone.